How does a man react when his own brother laughs and says the locks on his house have been changed? What happens when he stays calm, makes one quiet call, and lets the system answer for him by morning? This is how I learned that respect isn't taken by force. It's enforced by preparation. The key slipped into the lock with the familiar resistance I'd known for 7 years, but when I turned it, nothing happened. I tried again, thinking fatigue from the red-eye flight was making me clumsy. The metal ground against metal, but the deadbolt didn't budge. Standing on my own front porch at 11:47 p.m., suitcase at my feet and laptop bag cutting into my shoulder, I stared at the brass fixture that had never failed me before. The finish was different, newer, shinier. My stomach dropped as the realization hit. I pulled out my phone and dialed Evan's number. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered, bright with amusement. "Well, well, look who finally made it home. Marlene, put Evan on the phone." I kept my voice level, though my pulse was picking up speed. "Oh, he's right here. We're watching a movie in our living room." She drew out the word "our" like she was savoring it. "Evan, your brother wants to talk." I heard shuffling, then Evan's voice in the background, muffled but audible. "Tell him we changed the locks. We're taking responsibility for the house now." Marlene's laugh was sharp and delighted. "Did you hear that? We changed the locks today. Figured it was time we took charge of things around here, you know? Made some executive decisions." "Evan," my voice cut through her chatter. "Get on the phone, now." More shuffling. Marlene's voice grew distant as she apparently handed over the phone, but I could still hear her commentary. "Tell him about the mail situation, too, and the utilities." "Dean?" Evan's voice was quieter, almost sheepish, but there was something else underneath, a kind of defiant satisfaction. "Open the door. Look, man, we talked about this. You're never here anyway, and Marlene thinks—" "I don't care what Marlene thinks. This is my house. Open the door." A pause. Then Evan's voice, stronger now. "It's not just your house anymore. We live here too. We have rights." Across the street, Mrs. Patterson's porch light flickered on. Great. Now I had an audience for this humiliation. "You have rights as guests," I said carefully. "You don't have the right to change my locks." "Actually," Marlene's voice came through clearly now. She'd moved closer to the phone, or maybe taken it back. "We looked into it. Tenants' rights and all that. Since we've been living here for 8 months, we have legal standing. You can't just lock us out, and we can't let you lock us out either." The casual confidence in her voice made my jaw clench. "I'm not trying to lock you out. I'm trying to get into my own house." "Well, you should have thought about that before you left for a week without discussing it with us. We're a household now, Dean. Decisions get made collectively." I could hear Evan in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Marlene responded to him with something that sounded like agreement, then came back to the phone. "Look, we can talk about this tomorrow. There's a motel about 10 minutes down Route 9, the Comfort Inn. You'll be fine for one night." The line went quiet, except for the sound of the TV in the background. I could picture them in there. Marlene sprawled across my couch, Evan probably avoiding eye contact even though I couldn't see him, both of them in the house I'd worked 12 years to buy. "Evan," I said one more time. "What?" His voice was defensive now, all traces of sheepishness gone. I looked at Mrs. Patterson's lit window, then at my suitcase, then at the new lock that gleamed in the porch light. Something shifted inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold clarity. "Nothing," I said. "Enjoy your movie." I hung up before either of them could respond. For a long moment, I stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. Then I picked up my suitcase, walked to my car, and drove to the Comfort Inn. But I didn't go to sleep. Instead, I sat at the small desk by the window, opened my laptop, and started making a list. 3 months earlier, I'd been sitting in the departure lounge at Reagan National, phone pressed to my ear, while Evan's voice crackled through the connection. "It's just temporary, Dean, I swear, just until we get back on our feet." I'd watched planes taxi outside the terminal windows, calculating the cost of the work trip against the cost of helping family. How temporary? A month, maybe 2. Marlene's got some leads on jobs, and I'm waiting to hear back from that construction company in Fairfax. Marlene's voice had come through in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out words. "What did she say?" I'd asked. "She wants to know about the utilities, like, are they in your name? How does that work if we're staying there?" Even then, something had prickled at the back of my mind. "They stay in my name, it's my house." Right, of course. She just wants to make sure we're not going to freeze or anything." Evan had laughed, but it sounded forced. "You know how she worries." I'd known Marlene for exactly 6 weeks at that point, since Evan had introduced her as his serious girlfriend at a family barbecue that had ended with her lecturing our cousin about his parenting choices. Worry wasn't the word I'd have used to describe her primary emotion. But Evan had sounded desperate, and he was my brother. "Fine," I'd said as my boarding group was called. 2 months. We'll reassess after that. "You're the best, man. Seriously. We won't be any trouble." By the time I'd returned from that trip, Marlene had rearranged my kitchen for better efficiency, and Evan had moved my home office supplies to make room for what Marlene called their project space. I'd said nothing, telling myself it was temporary. A month later, mail started arriving addressed to Evan and Marlene Calix at my address. When I'd mentioned it, Marlene had waved it off. "Oh, that. Yeah, I had to put down an address for some job applications. You don't mind, do you? It's not like it's official or anything." But then there were magazine subscriptions, credit card offers, a voter registration form. Each piece of mail felt like another small claim staked on my property. "Marlene," I'd said one evening, finding her in my living room with papers spread across the coffee table, "we need to talk about the mail situation." She'd looked up with that bright, dismissive smile she used when she was about to explain why I was wrong about something. "What about it?" "You can't use this as your permanent address. This is temporary." "Well, of course it's temporary, but I can't just not have an address, Dean. How would that look to employers? Besides, it's not hurting anything." Evan had emerged from the kitchen then, beer in hand, and settled into what used to be my spot on the couch. "What's the problem?" "No problem," Marlene had answered before I could speak. "Dean's just worried about the mail. I told him it's not a big deal." "It's not a big deal," Evan had agreed, not looking at me. That was the pattern, I realized now, sitting in the hotel room with my laptop screen casting blue light across my face. Every boundary crossed, every assumption made, every small liberty taken, all of it presented as reasonable, temporary, not a big deal. When had Marlene started answering my phone? When had she begun speaking about our house, our decisions, our plans? When had Evan stopped looking me in the eye when these conversations came up? I scrolled through my text messages, looking for the progression. There it was, spread across 3 months of conversations. Evan, June 15th. "Thanks again for letting us crash. Won't forget this." Evan, July 2nd. "Marlene wants to paint the guest room. That cool?" Evan, July 18th. "Can you pick up some groceries on your way home? Marlene's making dinner for all of us." Evan, August 3. "We're thinking of getting a storage unit for some of our stuff. Make more room in the house." Evan, August 22. "Marlene's wondering about the lease situation. Like, what happens if something happens to you? We want to make sure we're protected." That last message had arrived while I was in Phoenix for a client presentation. I'd been standing in a hotel lobby, surrounded by the comfortable anonymity of business travelers, when the words had hit me. What happens if something happens to you? Not, "Thanks for helping us get back on our feet." Not, "We're excited to find our own place." But, what if something were to happen to you? as if my sudden absence was more probable than them moving out. I'd called that night, but Marlene had answered. "Oh, hi, Dean. Evan's in the shower. How's the trip going?" "Fine. Tell him I got his message about the lease." "Oh, that. Yeah, we were just talking about security, you know? Like, we've been living here for months now, we've got our lives set up here, but technically we don't have any legal protection. If something happened to you, or if you decided to sell the house or something, we'd be screwed." The casual way she'd said it, "if you decided to sell the house," had made my chest tighten. "It's my house, Marlene." "Well, sure, legally. But practically speaking, it's been our home for months now. We've put work into it. We've been maintaining it. We're the ones here day to day. There's got to be some kind of tenant protection or something." "You're not tenants. You're guests." "Are we?" Her voice had shifted, become more pointed. "Because guests don't usually stay for months. Guests don't usually get mail at the address, or change their voter registration, or build their lives around a place. I think what we are is more complicated than guests." I'd ended that call feeling like I'd been backed into a corner I hadn't seen coming. Now, staring at the progression of messages on my screen, I could see exactly how it had happened. Each request had seemed reasonable in isolation. Each boundary crossed had been presented as temporary, practical, not a big deal. But the cumulative effect was that somewhere along the way, I'd become a visitor in my own house. My phone buzzed with a new message. "Evan, don't be dramatic about this. We can talk tomorrow." I stared at the words for a long moment, then set the phone aside without responding. Instead, I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. Timeline: how I lost control of my own house. It was time to stop explaining myself and start documenting everything. The hotel room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sound of cars on the highway. I sat at the small desk, laptop open, and began organizing 8 months of messages, emails, and memories into a coherent picture. What emerged was a masterclass in manipulation. It started with need. Evan's desperate phone call, the promise that it was temporary, the appeal to family loyalty. Then came the small requests. Paint the room, answer the phone, accept some mail, each one reasonable, each one temporary, each one not a big deal. But reasonable requests became assumptions. Temporary became indefinite. Not a big deal became the new normal. My phone buzzed again. "Marlene, you're being childish. We're trying to have an adult conversation about living arrangements." I looked at the message, felt the familiar urge to respond, to explain, to defend my position. Then I deleted it without replying. Another buzz. "Evan, Marlene's right. We need to figure this out like adults. Stop sulking." Deleted. "Marlene, fine. Ignore us. But you can't just pretend this situation doesn't exist. We have rights." Deleted. I turned the phone face down and continued working. The pattern was clear now. Every time I'd tried to establish a boundary, Marlene had reframed it as unreasonable. Every time I'd asserted ownership, she'd countered with talk of tenant rights, household decisions, collective responsibility. And Evan had backed her up, or at least failed to back me up, which amounted to the same thing. But the most insidious part was how she'd made me feel like the problem, like I was being unreasonable for wanting control over my own property, like I was being selfish for not embracing their vision of our household. I opened my email and scrolled back through months of messages. There it was, in black and white, from Marlene Calix, tempigmail.com, to deanelixemail.com. Subject: household budget discussion. Dean, Evan and I have been talking about expenses. Since we're all living here together, it makes sense to split things more equitably. I've attached a spreadsheet breaking down utilities, groceries, maintenance costs, etc. Let me know when you want to discuss. Also, I think we should establish some house rules about guests, noise levels, shared spaces, etc. It's important that everyone feels comfortable in their own home. Talk soon, Marlene. I remembered getting this email. I remembered the spike of irritation at seeing household budget and house rules applied to my property. But I also remembered dismissing it, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. That had been my mistake. Not fighting wasn't the same as not caring. It was just delayed conflict, and in the meantime, Marlene had interpreted my silence as agreement. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, not a text. Evan's name on the screen. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail, then played the message. Dean, come on, man. This is ridiculous. We're family. Just come home and we'll talk this out. Marlene's not trying to steal your house or whatever you think is happening. She just wants some security, you know? Some sense that we're not going to be thrown out on the street if you have a bad day. That's not unreasonable. Call me back. The message ended, but the phone immediately rang again. Marlene this time. I let it go to voicemail too. Okay, Dean, I get it. You're upset. But this passive-aggressive thing isn't helping anyone. We're all adults here. We can figure this out. The bottom line is, we've been living there for 8 months. We've established residency. We have mail coming there. We're registered to vote there. We've made it our home. You can't just unilaterally decide that doesn't matter. There are laws about this stuff. So let's be smart and work together, instead of creating problems for everyone. Call me back. I deleted both messages without listening to them again. Then I opened a new browser window and searched for Arthur Levin Attorney Property Law. Arthur had handled the closing when I bought the house 7 years ago. If anyone would know how to untangle this mess, it would be him. His office website listed his hours. Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. It was currently 1:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. I composed a brief email. Arthur, I need legal advice about a property issue. 2 people have been staying in my house as temporary guests for 8 months. Tonight they changed the locks and are claiming tenant rights. I have documentation of the original arrangement and evidence that this was intended to be temporary housing, not a tenancy. Can we meet as soon as possible? Dean Calix. I hit send, then created a new folder on my laptop labeled 1247 Maple Street Legal Documentation. I began dragging emails, screenshots of text messages, and photos into the folder. My phone buzzed with another call. Evan again. This time I answered. What? Jesus, finally. Look, Dean, I know you're pissed, but I'm not pissed. You're not? No, I'm done. There was a pause. Done with what? Done explaining myself. Done justifying my right to control my own property. Done pretending this is a negotiation. Dean, come on, don't be like this. Like what? Like cold. This isn't like you. He was right. The old Dean would have been angry, would have argued, would have tried to make them see reason. The old Dean would have stood on that porch and demanded entry, would have escalated until the neighbors called the police, would have turned it into exactly the kind of dramatic scene Marlene was probably hoping for. But something had shifted when I'd hung up that first call. Maybe it was sitting in the hotel room, looking at the evidence of how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Maybe it was realizing that every time I'd tried to explain my position, I'd actually weakened it. You're right, I said. This isn't like me. The old me would have spent the next hour on the phone trying to convince you that I have the right to enter my own house. The old me would have treated this like a family dispute that could be resolved with enough talking. It is a family dispute. No, Evan. It's a legal matter now. You made it a legal matter when you changed my locks. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Marlene's voice in the background, urgent and insistent. Marlene wants to talk to you. I'm sure she does. Will you talk to her? No. Dean, I hung up. The phone immediately started ringing again, but I turned it off completely. Then I went back to work, organizing evidence and building a timeline. By morning, I would be prepared, but I wouldn't be explaining myself to anyone. Arthur Levin's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house in downtown Fairfax. All dark wood and leather-bound books that suggested competence without flashiness. I'd been there exactly once before, 7 years ago, when he'd walked me through the closing paperwork that made 1247 Maple Street legally mine. Now I sat across from his desk again, but this time I was the one with the problem. "Let me make sure I understand," Arthur said, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the documents I'd brought. "They've been staying with you for 8 months as temporary guests. No lease agreement, no rent payments, no written tenancy arrangement of any kind." "Correct. And last night they changed the locks and denied you entry to your own property." "Yes." Arthur leaned back in his chair, a man in his 50s who'd clearly dealt with every variation of property dispute imaginable. "Have they made any rent payments? Even informal ones?" "No. I've been covering all expenses." "Any written agreements about the length of their stay?" "Just text messages. I brought printouts." I slid a folder across his desk. "The original arrangement was for a month, maybe 2, while they got back on their feet." Arthur flipped through the messages, his expression neutral. "And these are your brother and his girlfriend?" "Yes." He set the papers aside and looked at me directly. "Dean, I'm going to be frank with you. Family situations like this can get complicated quickly, and the longer they've been there, the more complicated they become." My stomach dropped. "Are you saying they actually have tenant rights?" "I'm saying that after 8 months of residence, even without a formal lease, they may be able to claim some protections under Virginia's landlord-tenant laws. The question is whether a court would recognize them as tenants or as guests who have overstayed their welcome." "What's the difference?" "Tenants have rights, guests don't." Arthur pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "The good news is that they've made a tactical error by changing the locks. That's what we call self-help eviction, and it's illegal regardless of their status. You can't lock out a property owner, period." "So, what are my options?" "Several. We can file for immediate restoration of access, based on your ownership and their illegal exclusion. We can also pursue unlawful detainer proceedings to have them removed." Arthur looked up from his notes. "But I have to ask, do you want to maintain a relationship with your brother after this?" The question hung in the air. Did I? "I want my house back," I said finally. "Everything else is secondary." Arthur nodded. "Then we proceed aggressively but professionally. No drama, no emotion, just legal process. Can you document the lock change?" "I took photos of the new lock last night, and I can get a locksmith to confirm it was changed recently." "Good. Do that today. Also, file a police report for unlawful exclusion from your property. Don't let them talk you out of it by saying it's a civil matter. You have a right to access your own home." I felt something loosen in my chest. The first real relief I'd experienced in 12 hours. "How long will this take?" "If we move quickly, we can have you back in your house within 48 hours. Maybe sooner." Arthur began writing on his legal pad. "I'll draft an emergency motion for restoration of access. You get the locksmith documentation and police report. We file everything this afternoon. And then? Then we let the system work. No negotiations, no family meetings, no attempts to work things out. They made this a legal matter when they changed those locks. We respond accordingly." I left Arthur's office with a list of tasks and something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of control. The locksmith was my first stop. Henderson's Lock and Key occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop, the kind of place that had probably been family-owned for decades. "Changed overnight, you said?" The locksmith, a weathered man in his 60s, examined the photos on my phone. "That's a Schlage deadbolt, probably installed yesterday based on the scratches around the strike plate. You can see here where they had to adjust the fit." "Can you document that professionally?" "Sure can. You need this for court?" "Probably." He nodded without asking for details. "I'll write up a report. Cost you $50 for the documentation, plus I'll need to see the lock in person to make it official." We can do that this afternoon. Works for me. Fair warning, though. If they changed it once, they might change it again. You want me to rekey it properly when you get back in? Yes. My next stop was the police station. The desk sergeant, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, listened to my explanation with professional detachment. So you own the house? You have documentation of ownership, and they changed the locks to prevent your entry? That's right. Any threats made? Any use of force? No, they just denied me access. She handed me a clipboard with forms. Fill these out. We'll send an officer to take a report, probably this afternoon. Is this something you can help with, or is it a civil matter? Unlawful exclusion from your own property is a criminal matter, she said firmly. Doesn't matter if they're family or not. You have a right to access your home. By the time I finished at the police station, my phone had accumulated 7 missed calls and 12 text messages. I scrolled through them while sitting in my car in the parking lot. Evan, we need to talk about this. Marlene, your lawyer called our phone. This is getting ridiculous. Evan, Dean, come on. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. Marlene, fine. You want to play hardball? We know about the property tax situation and the HOA complaints. You're not as clean as you think. That last message made me laugh out loud. What property tax situation? What HOA complaints? I'd owned the house for 7 years without any issues, but apparently Marlene thought bluffing would work better than the truth. I deleted all the messages without responding and drove to the county records office. The clerk, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, pulled up my property records on his computer screen. 1247 Maple Street, purchased in 2016, sole owner Dean Calix, current on all taxes, no liens, no outstanding violations. He turned the screen toward me. You want copies of anything specific? The deed and the tax records for the past 2 years. That'll be $15 for copies. I paid and waited while he printed the documents. Everything was exactly as it should be. My name, my address, my property. No complications, no ambiguities, no room for interpretation. Walking back to my car, I felt my phone buzz with an incoming call. Unknown number. Dean Calix. Mr. Calix, this is Officer Reeves with Fairfax County Police. I understand you need to file a report about being excluded from your property. Yes. I can meet you at the address in about an hour, if that works for you. It works. Fair warning. If there are people inside claiming to live there, this could get complicated. You sure you want to go that route? I thought about Arthur's advice. No drama, no emotion, just legal process. I'm sure. All right, see you in an hour. I spent the remaining time at a coffee shop, organizing my documentation and reviewing Arthur's instructions. My phone continued to buzz with calls and messages, but I ignored them all. At exactly 3 p.m., I pulled into my driveway. Officer Reeves was already there, a stocky man in his 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of human conflict. Mr. Calix, let's take a look at this lock situation. The locksmith arrived a few minutes later and confirmed his earlier assessment. New lock, installed within the past 24 hours, scratches indicating hasty installation. And you have documentation of ownership? Officer Reeves asked. I handed him the folder of property records. He reviewed them carefully, then looked at the house. Anyone inside right now? As if summoned by the question, the front door opened and Marlene appeared, her earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Ma'am, are you a resident of this property? Yes, I live here with my boyfriend. We've been here for 8 months. And do you have a lease agreement or other documentation of tenancy? Marlene's eyes flicked to me, then back to the officer. It's a family situation. This is my boyfriend's brother's house, but we've been living here as residents, not guests. I see. And did you change the locks on this property? We made some security improvements. Yes. Officer Reeves made notes on his pad. Ma'am, regardless of your residential status, you cannot legally exclude the property owner from his own home. That's unlawful detention of property. But we have rights. That's a civil matter to be determined by the courts. This is a criminal matter. He looked at me. Mr. Calix, do you want to press charges for unlawful exclusion? I felt the weight of the moment. This was the point of no return, the moment when a family dispute became a legal case. Yes. Marlene's face went pale. Dean, don't do this. We can work this out. But I was done working things out. I was done explaining myself. I was done being reasonable while they were being manipulative. Officer Reeves, I said, I'd like to file that report now. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with a stack of legal documents spread across the small desk. Arthur had worked fast. The emergency motion for restoration of access was filed, the locksmith's report was notarized, and the police report was officially on record. We'll have a hearing tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Arthur had called to tell me. Emergency session. The judge will review the ownership documentation and the evidence of unlawful exclusion. If everything goes as expected, you'll have a court order for immediate restoration of access. And if they refuse to comply? Then it becomes contempt of court, and the sheriff's department handles enforcement. But it won't come to that. Most people comply when they realize the legal system is involved. I'd thanked him and hung up, then sat in the strange quiet of the hotel room, processing the events of the past 24 hours. This time yesterday, I'd been on a plane, thinking about quarterly reports and client presentations. Now I was preparing for a legal battle over my own home. My phone, which I'd finally turned back on, showed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. The progression told a story. Evan, 4:15 p.m. The police were here. What the hell, Dean? Marlene, 4:22 p.m. You're making a huge mistake. We have documentation, too. Evan, 4:45 p.m. Mom called. She heard about this. She's disappointed in you. Marlene, 5:10 p.m. Fine. You want to destroy your family over a house? That says everything about your priorities. Evan, 6:33 p.m. I never thought you'd choose property over family, but I guess I was wrong about who you really are. Marlene, 7:45 p.m. Your brother is devastated. I hope you're happy. Evan, 8:20 p.m. Last chance to fix this before it gets out of hand. I read through them all, waiting for some emotional response. Guilt, anger, regret. But all I felt was a kind of tired clarity. They were still trying to manipulate me, still trying to make this my fault, still trying to avoid accountability for their actions. The final message had arrived just 10 minutes ago. Marlene, we know about your financial problems, the missed payments last year, the credit issues. We can make this very complicated for you. I stared at the message, genuinely puzzled. What missed payments? What credit issues? I'd had a brief cash flow problem 18 months ago when a client was late on a large payment, but that had been resolved within 30 days. My credit was excellent, my mortgage was current, my finances were solid. But apparently, Marlene thought she could bluff her way out of this situation. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Arthur with a brief note. More attempted manipulation. Is this something we need to address legally? His response came back within minutes. Possibly extortion, depending on what they think they have. Document everything but don't engage. Let me handle any further communication. I turned the phone to silent and went back to organizing my documentation. Everything was ready for tomorrow's hearing. Property deed, tax records, original text messages establishing the temporary nature of their stay, evidence of the lock change, police report, locksmith's assessment. The case was straightforward. I owned the house, they were guests who had overstayed their welcome, and they had illegally excluded me from my own property. No amount of bluffing or emotional manipulation would change those facts. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock on my hotel room door. I looked through the peephole and saw Evan standing in the hallway, alone. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "We need to talk," he said. "No, we don't." "Dean, come on. This has gone far enough. Marlene's upset, I'm upset, Mom's upset. Can we fix this?" He looked tired, older than his 38 years. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy that had gotten me into this situation in the first place. "How do you want to fix it, Evan?" "We give you your key back. We work out some kind of arrangement that makes everyone comfortable. Maybe we pay rent. Maybe we help with expenses. Maybe we set up some kind of timeline for finding our own place." "And Marlene agrees to this?" "She will. She's just scared, you know. She doesn't want to be homeless again." "Again?" Evan's face shifted slightly. "She had some housing issues before we got together. Bad landlord situation. She's sensitive about security." "What kind of bad landlord situation?" Look, it doesn't matter. The point is, she's not trying to steal your house or whatever you think is happening. She just wants to feel secure." I studied my brother's face, seeing the careful way he was avoiding details, the way he was framing Marlene's behavior as understandable rather than addressing what she'd actually done. "Evan, do you think it was okay for her to change my locks?" "I think she was scared and she made a bad decision." "Do you think it was okay for you to support that decision?" I think we all made mistakes here." "What mistake did I make?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You left without talking to us about it. You just disappeared for a week without discussing it with the people who live in your house." "The people who live in my house as temporary guests." "Dean, it's been 8 months. At some point, temporary becomes permanent, whether you want to admit it or not." And there it was, the fundamental disagreement that couldn't be resolved through conversation. From Evan's perspective, time had transformed their status from guests to residents, regardless of any formal agreement. From my perspective, they were still guests who had violated the terms of their welcome. "The court will decide tomorrow what their status actually is," I said. "You're really going through with this?" "I'm really going through with this." Evan nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "Okay, but Dean, when this is over, when you've got your house back and you've proven your point, remember that Marlene and I will still be family, and family is supposed to matter more than property." "You're right," I said. "Family is supposed to matter more than property. That's why I let you stay for 8 months without rent. That's why I covered all the expenses while you got back on your feet. That's why I didn't set firm boundaries when I should have." "Then why?" "Because family also means not taking advantage of each other. It means not changing someone's locks and claiming their property. It means not trying to manipulate them with guilt when you get caught." Evan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Marlene says you're going to try to have us arrested." "I'm going to enforce my property rights. What happens after that depends on how you and Marlene respond to the court order." "And if we comply? If we give you the house back?" "Then you comply with the court order, and we move forward from there." "But things won't go back to how they were." "No," I said. "They won't." Evan nodded again, then turned and walked toward the elevator. I watched him go, feeling something like grief for the relationship we'd had before this happened, but not enough grief to change my mind. I closed the door, set my alarm for 6 a.m., and went to sleep. Tomorrow, the system would provide the answer that conversation couldn't. The courthouse was busy at 8:30 a.m., filled with lawyers, clerks, and people dealing with the various crises that required judicial intervention. I sat on a bench outside the emergency hearing room, reviewing my documentation one final time, while Arthur spoke quietly with the court clerk. "Judge Morrison is reviewing the filings now," Arthur said, settling beside me. "She's thorough, but fair. If the facts are as clear as they appear to be, this should be straightforward." My phone buzzed with a text from Evan. Last chance to call this off. I showed it to Arthur, who shook his head. "Don't respond. Let the court handle it." At exactly 9 a.m., we were called into the hearing room. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, sat behind the bench reviewing a stack of papers. "This is an emergency motion for restoration of access to property," she said without looking up. "Mr. Calix, you're claiming that you've been unlawfully excluded from your own home?" "Yes, Your Honor. And the respondents are your brother and his girlfriend, who have been staying with you as guests." "That's correct." Judge Morrison looked up from the papers. "Where are the respondents? Were they properly notified of this hearing?" Arthur stood. "Your Honor, we attempted service at the property address. The respondents refused to accept service but were verbally notified of the hearing time and location." "I see." The judge made a note. "Mr. Levin, walk me through the facts." Arthur laid out the case methodically. My sole ownership of the property, the temporary arrangement that had been extended indefinitely, the lack of any formal tenancy agreement, the changing of the locks, and my exclusion from the property. "Your Honor," Arthur concluded, "this is a clear case of unlawful exclusion. Regardless of any claimed tenancy rights, the respondents cannot legally prevent the property owner from accessing his own home." Judge Morrison reviewed the ownership documents, the police report, and the locksmith's assessment. "Mr. Calix, what was the original agreement with your brother and his girlfriend?" I stood. "Your Honor, they needed temporary housing while they got back on their feet. The original arrangement was for 1 to 2 months. I have text messages documenting this." "And how long have they actually been there?" 8 months. "Any rent payments or formal lease agreements?" "No, Your Honor, I've covered all expenses." Judge Morrison nodded and made more notes. Then she looked toward the back of the courtroom. "Are the respondents present?" I turned and saw Evan and Marlene sitting in the back row. Marlene looked composed, almost defiant. Evan looked miserable. "We're here, Your Honor," Marlene said, standing up. "Do you have legal representation?" "We represent ourselves." "Very well. Ms. Marlene Calix." I noticed she'd used Evan's last name, though they weren't married. Another small claim of legitimacy. "Ms. Calix, do you dispute that Mr. Dean Calix owns the property at 1247 Maple Street?" "No, Your Honor, but we dispute that ownership gives him the right to unilaterally exclude residents who have established tenancy." "Do you have a lease agreement?" "No, but we have established residency through continuous occupation, mail delivery, voter registration, and contribution to household maintenance." Judge Morrison looked skeptical. "You changed the locks on the property?" "We made security improvements that we felt were necessary for our safety and the safety of the property." "Without the owner's permission?" Marlene hesitated. "We felt that as residents, we had the right to ensure our security." "I see." Judge Morrison turned to Evan. "Mr. Evan Calix, do you have anything to add?" Evan stood slowly. "Your Honor, this is my brother's house. I know that. But we've been living there for 8 months. It's been our home. We didn't mean for this to become a legal situation." "But you did change the locks?" "Yes, ma'am." "Without your brother's permission?" "Yes, ma'am." Judge Morrison made more notes, then looked up. "Here's what I see. Mr. Dean Calix owns the property in question. The respondents have been staying there as guests with no formal tenancy agreement and no rent payments. Regardless of the length of their stay, they do not have the right to exclude the property owner from his property." She turned to Marlene and Evan. "Changing the locks without the owner's permission constitutes unlawful exclusion, which is a serious matter. The fact that your family members doesn't change the legal reality." "But, Your Honor," Marlene interjected, "we have tenant rights under Virginia law." "Ms. Calix, even if you could establish tenancy, which is questionable given the lack of formal agreement or rent payments, tenants cannot exclude landlords from the property. There are proper procedures for addressing landlord-tenant disputes, and changing the locks isn't one of them." Judge Morrison looked down at her papers again. "I'm granting the motion for restoration of access. The respondents will immediately provide Mr. Dean Calix with keys to the property and will not interfere with his access to his own home." She looked up at Marlene and Evan. Furthermore, if you wish to remain on the property, you'll need to negotiate a formal arrangement with Mr. Calix. If no such arrangement can be reached, proper eviction procedures must be followed. You cannot simply exclude the owner and claim the property. Your Honor, Marlene said, her composure finally cracking, we have nowhere else to go. That's unfortunate, but it doesn't give you the right to exclude the property owner from his home. The court order is effective immediately. Judge Morrison turned to the court clerk. Please ensure that the sheriff's department is available to enforce this order if necessary. Arthur leaned over and whispered, She's giving them a chance to comply voluntarily before involving law enforcement. Judge Morrison addressed the room again. Mr. Dean Calix, you will have immediate access to your property. Respondents, you have until 5 p.m. today to provide keys and restore access. Failure to comply will result in enforcement by the sheriff's department and potential contempt charges. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. As we filed out of the courtroom, I could hear Marlene's voice behind me, urgent and angry. This isn't over. We have other options. But Evan's voice was quieter. Marlene, stop. It's over. Arthur and I walked to the parking lot in silence. Finally, he said, That went as well as we could have hoped. Judge Morrison was clear and firm. They'll comply. And if they don't? Then the sheriff's department will ensure compliance. But it won't come to that. Your brother seems to understand the situation. I looked back toward the courthouse, where Evan and Marlene were having what appeared to be an intense conversation on the steps. What happens now? Now you wait until 5 p.m. If they provide the keys and restore access, you're back in your house tonight. If they don't, we call the sheriff. And after that? Arthur closed his briefcase and looked at me directly. After that, Mr. Calix, you decide what kind of relationship you want to have with your brother. But you'll be making that decision from your own house, with your own locks, on your own terms. I drove back to the hotel to wait. At 3:30 p.m., my phone rang. Evan's number. We'll have the keys ready by 5, he said without preamble. Good. Dean, I'm sorry about all of this. I know we screwed up. I was quiet for a moment. Where will you go? Marlene has some options. We'll figure it out. And you? I'll figure it out too. Evan, don't try to fix this right now, okay? Let's get through today. He hung up before I could respond. At 4:45 p.m., I drove to my house. Evan was sitting on the front steps, alone, with a set of keys in his hand. Where's Marlene? Gone. She left an hour ago. He stood up and held out the keys. These are yours. I took them, feeling their familiar weight. The original locks? No. We had to call a locksmith to change them back. Cost us $200. He almost smiled. Marlene wasn't happy about that. I put the key in the lock and turned it. It opened smoothly. Evan, I said, turning back to him. But he was already walking toward a car I didn't recognize, parked at the curb. I'll call you in a few days, he said without looking back, when things settle down. I watched him drive away, then walked into my house. It was exactly as I'd left it 8 months ago, except quieter. I set my keys on the kitchen counter, walked through each room, and confirmed that everything was in order. Then I sat down in my living room, in my chair, in my house, and finally allowed myself to feel the relief of being home. Outside, the sun was setting. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be. I had learned something important. Respect isn't taken by force. It's enforced by preparation, protected by boundaries, and maintained by the willingness to let the system provide what conversation cannot. My phone buzzed with a text message from Arthur. Everything resolved? I typed back, yes, thank you. Then I turned off the phone, locked the door with my own key, and settled into the quiet of my own space. Some battles aren't won through confrontation. They're won through calm competence, clear documentation, and the patience to let reality speak for itself. The locks were changed back. The house was mine again. And I had learned the difference between helping family and enabling manipulation. It was a lesson worth 8 months of aggravation and one very expensive legal education. But as I sat in my living room that evening, surrounded by the peace of restored boundaries, I knew it was also a lesson that would serve me well for the rest of my life.